Well, welcome everyone. We're so glad you're here on this chilly evening. I hope that you're in a cozy place. We are so excited. Pastor Kelly has given us the opportunity to interview him tonight, which is an awesome opportunity that we've actually been thinking about for a while in this past week. And also, there's so many things we want to know and ask. So it's an exciting moment. And we'll also make sure that you have time to ask your questions too at the end for sure and be able to connect that way. My name is Jen. I've been at CLNE for almost 2 years now, coming up in May. And we are going to do tonight just a little bit differently. So we're going to walk you through it. Our plan for tonight is we'll take some time connecting and centering ourselves for the evening. And then we're going to actually break the evening up into two big parts of really yummy conversation. Being on the week of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we are going to let that be kind of a thread, a theme throughout the evening, and spend some time getting Pastor Kelly's thoughts and his experience and stories from the way that Reverend Dr. King has impacted his life and his leadership, and the way that we have all had the opportunity to witness him in his leadership in our communities. And then as he's had time to share with us, then we'll get to talk with each other and have a good space for breakout conversations, looking at our own stories and how we have been impacted by Reverend Dr. King. Then we'll come back together again and lean in just a little bit more to the juicy good stuff of living into the tension and hope of the philosophy and stories and vision of Dr. King and PK's work and mission. And we'll have another conversation in breakout rooms, and then we'll end the night together in a closing conversation. So that's where we're headed, and I'm so glad that thanks for being here. As we begin, we're going to take a moment to recognize where we are. So if you'll just take a moment to settle your body where you are in the space, maybe even setting your feet onto the floor. Notice how you're sitting in your chair or in a comfortable position. And let's breathe together, recognizing the land that we are on. As we gather tonight, asking the question, how do we build true relationships across difference? We acknowledge the sacred lands on which we stand. The Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement is located on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. We are in close proximity to the territories of the Anishinaabe and Ho-Chunk peoples. This land has been stewarded as a living relative by the Dakota for generations. The United States government effectively stole this land from the Dakota people through a series of unjust treaties and broken promises, followed by targeted efforts of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal. For this, we repent and commit to doing better. We look to the Dakota people and all Native American communities as examples of resilience, resistance, and strength. We are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and to work in this community on this territory. As we enter into conversations of racial justice tonight, let us remain mindful of these broken covenants and commit to building trust in all our relations.
Thank you, Jen. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Sabano Moynihan, and I'm also on staff at CLNE for a little over a year and a half now. And I also have the great pleasure of co-interviewing Pastor Kelly tonight. And yeah, I really look forward to hearing some of his stories. I know I'm one of many people in the room whose life has been influenced by Pastor Kelly and his leadership profoundly. So next we're going to have our centering time. And as you can see, we're going to hear this poem called The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. And she read this poem at Joe Biden's inauguration.
Mr. President, Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first. We must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So, while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain: if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the west. We will rise from the wind-swept northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked south. We will rebuild reconcile and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
Well, thank you to Amanda and her powerful visionary leadership. And now we have the great privilege of hearing from one of the most generous, courageous, wise, visionary leaders that I know personally. And that is the one and only Pastor Kelly Chatman. Welcome to Pastor Kelly. I gotta make the most of being on this end of the microphone.
Thank you, Rachel. Can you hear me okay?
How's this sound? Can you say one more thing?
How's my sound?
It is better.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the kind words, and thank you everyone for gathering this evening. And how amazing Amanda's poem is in terms of its relevance today. Really, it's most prophetic in terms of our times. And I can only think about how she's picked up the mantle of Martin Luther King. So thank you for lifting up her voice this evening.
Mm-hmm.
It's thank you. I'm humbled by this opportunity, and let's get at it.
All right, let's get at it. Yeah. Well, so as we mentioned, we wanted to have this evening kind of connect with the theme of Dr. King Day. And so first, Pastor Kelly, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how Dr. King was present and influential in your childhood. What are some of your memories of that?
Again, thank you for this opportunity. And reflecting back on the impact that Dr. King had on me is, I remember I must have been 5 or 6 years old when I first became aware of Dr. King. And my family had moved from the south to the north, from the agricultural south to the agricultural segregated south to the industrial integrated north when I was like 5 years old. And so we didn't go to church other than on Easter, as our parents were carving out a new beginning. And so we did church in our home. And so we would line up, and our father would have us memorize a Bible verse, and then we'd have to repeat it, on like Sunday afternoon. And I share that because I didn't really know what a pastor was. And so my introduction to what a pastor was, we had one of those big box TVs that was on the floor, and it had this big antenna with rabbit ears, and so we would watch that TV. And I remember I was watching TV with my family, and there was a man standing behind a podium, and he was talking in the midst of people being attacked by police dogs and billy clubs and fire hoses. And I heard that man speaking on behalf of those people that were being abused and oppressed. And so that was my introduction to what a pastor was. And so I think about how that really became my orientation to what it meant to be a pastor. And so I was endeared to that picture of who a pastor was, what a pastor stood for. And the other thing that I remember as that introduction was going, I grew up in Detroit, and I see there's someone with us today who's also from Detroit, I think Ingrid welcome. And so just about any black home that you went into back at that time, you would go into the house and there would be a picture of the Lord's Supper, Jesus and this meal, and a picture of Martin Luther King that would be on the wall. And so that was a part of the culture and the hope and the identity. So it was really embedded in that sense of community and investment and hope for the future. And some of those homes also had a picture of John F. Kennedy, but almost to a household, you would see that picture of the Lord's Supper and Martin Luther King prominently posted in those houses. And so that was my orientation, that a pastor was somebody that that really spoke on behalf of the people that weren't spoken for or valued. That the other thing, and I don't know if this really fits with that or not. So as I grew older, and I was in high school, and I had this big poster that I had on my wall, and it was a picture of a pastor who was preaching from a pulpit, and sitting in the pew was Jesus, and Jesus was sleeping, and and so that always been like that critique of um, if the pastor wasn't saying and being relevant, then that was really kind of putting Jesus to sleep, and that so that was an edge that I even as a high schooler that was important to me.
I love that so much, PK. I'm just knowing how you preach, I'm sure Jesus doesn't fall asleep at all. Can you share a little bit about how Dr. King shaped your journey as a leader and as a pastor?
Yeah, just justice was always a part of it, and my father was a part of that too. That he would point out things in terms of uh, the inequity and racism. So when I was growing up, there was this girl. Her name was Shirley Temple, and we loved watching Shirley Temple. She was maybe 6, 7 years old, really talented. But there would always be Shirley Temple was the center of the narrative, but she'd be surrounded by waiters who were black or tap dancers, and so it was always this young white child that was centering, and the black people would be staged in a very lesser role. And my father would also point out another popular thing that some of us will remember was there was a movie Tarzan. It was always Tarzan would be in the jungle, and it was this white man and Jane, the white woman, and it would be all of the indigenous people, Africans, that would be subservient to Tarzan and Jane. And so my father pointed that out as a critique of what it was that we were seeing, and then translating that back into our context growing up here in the United States. So there was all of that backdrop. And then Martin Luther King, in many ways, and the civil rights leaders became a voice that was indigenous, that was strong, that spoke out in opposition to that prejudice or racial bias. The other thing about that was the visibility of the civil rights movement, and how that also stood out a voice that was an emerging voice about resistance to oppression, particularly advocating for voting rights. And then the opposition to that of bombings in churches and children being and all of the abuses and people entering into schools and the resistance to that, the violence. And so it was a really tumultuous time, but it was also a time when the clarity of a voice in opposition to that and lifting up a voice for justice. It was voices that came out of the church, the black church, but it was also a very visible time when the Black church was not alone, and the faith community were pastors and rabbis that coalesced in opposition to to racism and segregation specifically. It was a tumultuous time, but with that tumultuous time, there was also a clear opposition to that in terms of the voices of disruption to that. And it was, and it's very different from today because it was really a bold galvanizing of leaders who were Black and white. So it wasn't necessarily that they were large in numbers, but it was unique. Those pastors and rabbis that did join forces with like SNCC, the Southern Justice League, and the NAACP. The clarity, there was a real clarity during that time about a voice that stood up. And at the center of that was Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Although Malcolm X was a more segregated voice of that, but a voice in alignment with the voice of Martin Luther King. And I'll just add to that. And then when I got to college, I really was attracted to studying Martin Luther King, and just how clearly and how he studied that love was a force, that literally studying love as a force that was more powerful than hate. And so how he studied the practice and the faith of Jesus. Not just as a religiosity, but there's a real strategy in how Jesus loved and stood with and broke down cycles of oppression. There's a real strategy in how King studied Gandhi and how love was more powerful than hate. And there was also philosophers like Whitehead was one of the philosophers, but and the intentionality and the depth of Martin Luther King's commitment to love as a strategy, and then how that strategy was really, so many young people from across the country came and invested in that strategy and adhered to that strategy when they were being spat on and beaten. So it was really I think it's an unfortunate thing for many young people today that they didn't go through the crucible of witnessing the depth of commitment that so many people made to resisting segregation. So many people from the North that came and were murdered as part of that and spat on. I mean, it was such a it was such a drastic picture of resistance that yeah. So you got me started. Yeah.
That's what we were hoping to do. Well, PK, we have one more question for you before we pause for some small group time. I wonder if you could share one story or example of where you've seen Dr. King's philosophy or vision for the world lived out in the communities you've served and you've been a part of. And it could even be in a small way.
I mean, it's in so many ways, and it's there are two that one is Martin Luther King's letters from Birmingham jail, right? Like 6,000 words, and it's such so much depth in what he wrote about. and how he was writing to his white uh, uh, pastors who were engaged in the movement, but got to that place of unwilling or unable to enter into that place of resistance, where they would actually go against the authorities, and actually where it wasn't that they were doing it just for somebody else, but at the point where it was about their own transformation, um, and not able to go there. Right? And so Martin Luther King, that letter from Germany was a reflection uh, that wasn't just about a movement, but or an indictment, but a challenge to white uh, allies uh, to actually be accomplices, and the inability for those white people to do that. The other thing about that, and this is something I read from a book at Oxford called A God's Long Summer, and it talked about how in the South, and I don't mean to demean the South, because Malcolm X said that the South begins at the Canadian border, right? So, but in this reflection, the book talked about in the South how there's a culture that about how things, uh, it's a part of the culture to not confront uh, systems, and so a system change, and so it's so embedded, particularly in the Southern Church, that it's like you don't go there when it comes to confronting systems. And so I had a sabbatical where I visited the South, and I happened to be sitting in a church where I worshiped, and it was a text that was very much, it was like it just laid it out there for a social justice sermon. And I was just amazed at how artfully the pastor preached a really good sermon, but it didn't cross that line of confronting the systemic injustice. And so to be able to just see how ingrained that is in the culture, and so how hard it is maybe to confront a system when we're so acculturated to not go there.
Thank you, PK.
Thank you, Pastor Kelly. I'm going to share our screen, but I just invite everyone to take a deep breath, because that was lots of big things to think about. And as we were thinking of what we'd be saying in our groups, recognizing that we're an intergenerational group, this is an exciting time to hear each other's stories. So as we go off into our groups, first of all, the way that we meet and speak with each other, we hope that you'll take a moment to introduce yourself. And then as folks are sharing, that you would take that extra effort to listen well, really intentionally listening and hearing from each person in your group. And then as you're sharing, to share from your own experiences using your I statements. And then the 3 questions we're curious about that I hope your group has time to dive into. First is, of what Pastor Kelly was just sharing with us, what surprised you or challenged you or inspired you as you were listening? And then from your own experience, what are your memories of Dr. King and the civil rights movement as a child, knowing that some were living during the civil rights movement, some were learning about it? And then are there ways you learned an incomplete story about Dr. King when you were younger? And we'll take roughly 15 minutes in our group and about 3 to 4 folks. So I'm kind of dividing it so everyone has some time to share. And then we'll meet back here and continue the conversation. We'll also make sure the questions go into the chat. That was very quickly shared and then disappeared. So we'll drop it for you. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome. We hope you had a rich time together. I know those questions were pretty juicy. So we're going to transition into a few more questions that we have for Pastor Kelly. And then we'll have a little more small group time and then some time as a large group at the end where you can share some insights or other questions that are coming to you. So next, Pastor Kelly, similar to a question that your small group may have discussed around that incomplete story we may have learned about Dr. King as younger people, I wonder what you think of as some of the things that people sometimes misunderstand or misrepresent about Dr. King and his approach or his leadership or whatever you want to share.
I think what white people miss out on, and unfortunately, not only white people, but everybody, because racism is is formed out of a white narrative, okay? And so in response to racism, there is there's a fight for liberation from that, and so much of the attention goes into responding to that narrative that we miss the beauty and the richness of Martin Luther King as a human being, as a father who grew up in a wonderful, rich experience of church, where his father was a pastor in a neighborhood that was a strong neighborhood, uh, and then going to a university that was a strong university, Morehouse. And so there's so much richness that is there. And there's not enough about that cultural, that heritage, that richness of Martin Luther King and the church that he came from and the neighborhood that he came from and the university he came from. And so that narrative uh, is a beautiful narrative. But the narrative that is the history is about responding to white racism. And that's important, but it's not the whole story. So that's my point. And so today, myself included, so much of my life is about responding to a dominant white narrative and not diving more deeply into my own experience. So this is quickly. So when I was in college, I visited Jamaica with a class, and it was early in the morning. I went out on the while I was waiting for my classmates to come out. We're in Kingston, and it was rush hour. And I was just standing there mindlessly watching the traffic go by. And I realized that the doctors on those buses and the nurses on those buses and the secretaries and all of that traffic, they were largely people that looked like me. And until that moment, I never imagined that the doctors, the lawyers, the secretaries, that they could be people that look like me. So I was so ingrained in a narrative that was centered around whiteness. And so the fact that I never even imagined that as a possibility, just that's a part of what Martin Luther King stood for, but we never get to that part of the story. We don't get to that narrative. And so for me or for my white brothers and sisters, we're still so caught up in that narrative of whiteness that we don't dive more deeply into our own giftedness.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I wonder if you could, I know we have another question coming, but I wonder if you could say, if you want to add anything about the part of the narrative, a dominant narrative about Dr. King as being kind of nice and palatable and everybody's cool with Dr. King Day versus how he was really received at the time by much of the country.
No, I don't think that that's so much about Dr. King as that is about our own uh, um, concern and or critique about being nice. Martin Luther King was not nice. He had a strategy about love. And so to equate love with nice, I think is an abuse of the understanding of love, right? So Martin Luther King, love was a force, and it was a force that was more powerful than hate. And it was a force that compelled Martin Luther King to go into those places where he knew that there was going to be a white lash or a backlash. He knew that there would be a price for sitting at the table. He knew that there would be a price for confronting the president of the United States about a war in Vietnam. It's like, so how I'm a little bit critical of how did that get interpreted to be that it was about him being nice when everything that he did was about putting his life on the line. And I don't know where any of that can equated him to being nice. So I think that's something for us to really wrestle with, because I really did study that Martin Luther King, and talking about love as more powerful than hate, was a compelling statement about going to those places where there's resistance um, to my showing up in those spaces where um, the whiteness says I'm not supposed to be here, right? Whether it's a lounge counter or who I date, or resisting killing people in Vietnam uh, um, for an unjust war. I mean, that's a great question, Rachel, and I think we ought to really challenge ourselves in saying, okay, well, how does his action, um, what causes us to interpret that as being nice? And it's a challenge for me too. Because if you can say that about Martin Luther King, you can say that about me too. Because a lot of people think that I'm nice. Um, and I think that's part of that. I think it's interpreted as nice if you're at a table or in a space that some would deem you're not supposed to be, because we're so oppositional about uh, if if I'm in a white audience or among white people, then I must be nice, as opposed that that's a part of an advancing movement. Right? And I'm saying I don't know this. I'm just saying it's where I go in response to your question, which is a good question.
Okay, earlier today we were talking a lot about this word about tension. We keep hearing Dr. King saying leaning into discomfort and leaning into tension. And then you had shared also about the piece of hope. And I'm just curious, after what you've just shared, and then knowing our reflections, we'll move into talking about the tension of bringing about justice and change. What do you feel about the importance of the tension and the discomfort, and then the racial element, me as a white woman leaning into tension, and then your experience?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'm still caught up in. I think there's something about judgment, about moving into spaces that we're not supposed to be in, being with people that we're not supposed to be with. And back and during the civil rights and segregation, that there were water fountains that you were not supposed to drink from. There were places on the bus that you were not supposed. So this being locked into a system that defines who and what, that if you do certain things, then you get labeled, you get the stigma. And I think we all navigate that. And I think when that's internalized, that doesn't just happen from white people. Um, we all adopt into that kind of system of thinking about stay in your place. And when we dare to move beyond those spaces and out of those places, then there's labeling that happens, whether it's about maybe that label is they say you're too nice or you do this or you're too that. And what we do is we acquiesce to that. And so we stay in our places, which I think also gets to your question about that we also, for many of us, it's about being comfortable and being those places that are of comfort to us, and so we don't embrace the tension that comes from being with difference, and that's a lot of what the work that we do at CLNE. It's about the difference. It's part of the process of being whole, right? And so embracing those places. So curiosity. The curiosity in being with somebody who doesn't think like me, being in those spaces, I think makes us more whole and more human, and less defined by external forces. I think it's a big question that you're asking, but I also think so. I would say, as tragic as it was, the murder of George Floyd led to a disruption that really opened things up in terms of people seeing the world differently, seeing policing different, all of that stuff. And for 20 days, it opened it up. Right? And then what happens after 20 days, we go back to our places of comfort. Right? Same old, same old. So philanthropy opened up tremendously. And after 20 days, I mean, metaphorically, 20 days, it goes back to those places of same old, same old. And I think that's a lot of what happened with the civil rights movement too, and the murder of Martin Luther King. A certain amount of time, particularly like the church and institutions, go back to those places of comfort. Same old, same old.
Thanks, Pastor Kelly. Patricia, I saw that your hand was raised. Did you want to ask a question or share?
Oh, it was about being stigmatized for stepping out of your lane.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, resonated with what you said about in the South. There's such strong pressure just to not step forward and, not go against whatever is, seemingly majority will. But I mean, the hard thing about that is I know that the undercurrent, or what's true for a lot of people, is not what the supposed majority is saying. And I don't know. I have the privilege to step out of my lane, but a lot of people don't feel that they do.
So Patricia, good to see you. Can you say a little bit that you're speaking out of experience that you spent time in the South, right?
Yeah, I grew up there. Yeah. Oh, I was saying in my small group, I mean, we hardly, what we heard about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was very narrow and limited in retrospect. I hardly knew much about anything. It wasn't part of our schooling. It wasn't in the newspapers. And whatever it was like, so, Obama gets elected. All my relatives went and bought guns or more guns.
Mm-hmm.
And, that was the reaction to the civil rights movement, was control by whatever means. And 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 also just growing up with the separate, not even separate, but equal. That was the theory. That was the the law, separate but equal. But Black people weren't equal. They're totally dehumanized. Yeah. And I don't know, what was it like growing up in the North? I know there's racism in the North. I've encountered a lot of racism in the North. It's just different. And I'm sorry that George Floyd had to die, but I'm sorry people have to die for people like me to wake up. But, it's a privilege to wake up.
Thanks for sharing, Patricia. Pastor Kelly, how are you feeling? Would you like to keep sharing or send everyone to breakout rooms to have conversation? Or
I think breakout room would be great.
Okay.
Process and what you shared, what Patricia shared, it's powerful.
Sounds good. So we'll move into a second set with the same folks that you were just with to go a little bit deeper. It says we'll be in groups for 20 minutes because of the richness of our conversation, we're gonna make it about 10 minutes. So finding your thoughts and getting right into it as you get out into your room. And we have two questions for you. First question is, how has your understanding of Dr. King's views and values changed over time? You kind of gave us a little bit to already be chewing on there. And then how do you lean into tension for justice and change? And so we'll go for 10 minutes and we'll come back and then we'll have some time to share as a large group as well. Also, kind of listening for the group to share back when we get back together.
Hello. Welcome back. Again, I hope you had a rich conversation. So we have about 8 minutes until our wrap-up time, and we would love to hear from some of you. You might share insights or things that came up in your small groups, experiences of your own that have come up in this conversation. You are welcome to ask another question of Pastor Kelly. We'd love to hear what's on your mind. And we'll have time for probably just a few. So let's keep it brief enough that we can hear more than one person.
This is Katja. I will say that I think we got to a very interesting point in our conversation right before this ended, and that is the whole the thing that I hear in my church and elsewhere. Well, I don't know any Black people. I don't work with any Black people. It's like, and that feels like, and therefore I know that if I met somebody, I would be good to them, but I don't know anyone. It's like, well, okay, that's not where it stops then. Let's walk out the door of the church and move beyond all the other kind of boundaries that we have established, we white people, for ourselves, so that we don't have to be afraid and we don't have to potentially enter into conflict. And move up, because people are in the town center, like where the intersections are. It's not hard to go and attend a Black church. Not hard to go and do shopping and go to restaurants, and where folks that look different than you do are. Anyway, but it's that question of how do you move people? How do we each kind of step out of our comfort zone?
Thank you for that, Katja. Yeah, and I also think that as a white person, I was conditioned to see the work of racial justice or the work of anti-racism as happening just in those cross-racial moments between a white person and a person of color. And yet, sometimes the times when I'm in a room full of white people or I'm with my white family or my white friend, those can be sometimes the moments where there's the most work to do around untangling and excavating the ways that racism lives in us. And I think we miss that part of what the work is too. Yeah, thank you. Any other insights, things you want to share, questions?
I'd like to just say one thing, and that's I've learned not to try to debate or change or fix other people in this racial conversation. What I've learned from Pastor Kelly is just tell my story, because no one can deny it and no one can refute it. I can just tell my story and then let it land and let people do with it what they want. And that's really helped me.
Yeah, I think it might, thank you, Janet. I think sometimes it might be helpful for us to also talk about the systems that perpetuate the isms and racism. So to be able to talk about that and how that complicates the relationships, because there's systems in place that don't facilitate us being in relationship. Okay? And out of those systems, those stories evolve.
Because systems, by their definition, are self-perpetuating, right? It's so very hard to look critically, for a system to look critically at itself.
So could we name a few and just, kind of explore maybe what some ways to pull it up the heat, or, I don't know. I'd just like to talk about that a little bit more in detail.
Yeah. And maybe we could do that at our next month. But like churches are systems, synagogues are systems, suburbs are systems, housing are systems. There are ways that structurally, so like suburbs were designed out of an intention where there was flight out of neighborhoods, and highway systems perpetuated that. There are all those ways that make it more difficult for us to be in relationship, physically in relationship with one another. In the same grocery stores, in the same restaurants. So it would be to have the time to actually explore Carol's what you're saying would, I think, could be healthy.
Thank you. Thank you. I would love that conversation.
Well, let's do it.
But I think the systems there's some of the systems, because of changing attitudes and whatever, are loosening up, but it's that the people who are sort of the old guard or whatever are still making sure that they keep some power. And so it's always the surprise. For me, it's when somebody will say something, either I was with nephews and we're in a store, and all of a sudden they're accused of trying to break things because of their their big hands or whatever. You know, that were, there's just the surprises that come up. And then it's not really the systems, but it's just the overtones that are still so much integrated into society that surprises you, that kind of puts you back or tells you, do I really want to be here? You know, I'm not going to give this place my money anymore. So we quit going there, or, you know, those kind of things. I have grand nieces and nephews now that go to school in Edina. And I remember teaching, now I hate to say this, almost 30 years ago, a teacher in Edina had me come in to talk about my experiences as a Latina and talking about racism at that time. And, you know, I would never picture that I would have Black grandnieces that would go to Edina schools and be probably the best education they got out of Egan. And they were in Lakeville, they were in Egan, Brooklyn Park, and they got to Edina and they got the, you know, and then they were in Minneapolis as well. And they're, you know, they get this education, very supportive and very welcoming. They even felt more welcome there than they did in Egan. And it's, you know, it's like, okay, but be on guard, be, you know, be ready for the surprise. And, you know, so far they haven't had it.
Mm.
And it's been 3 years now for them.
Oh. It's valuable to have the space to share these stories that demythologize some of the stereotypes and some of the myths. Um,
Thank you. Always those last minutes where it could go another good hour or two, all the juiciness in it. I'm going to share with you a few things that are coming up at CLNE or with CLNE, making sure that you know that you are warmly invited. I'm just trying to find it here. Hold 1 second. Where'd it go? So if you haven't met Robert Coleman yet, he's a local artist in North Minneapolis. So this would be a Minneapolis fave and an opportunity for those who are in Minneapolis. I know we're kind of across a couple states here as we're gathered. But this Saturday, Robert Coleman is going to be leading an event where he's going to teach us how to paint, which seems like a miracle in itself. And then also be sharing his own work. And he was actually with us at Come Together a few months ago, back I think in October. And while he was speaking with us, he actually created several pieces of art. So for those of us who are going to learn how to paint, I think we're gonna have a very powerful experience. It's being held at Nativity Lutheran. And if you are interested in it, in joining us, there are just a few more spots available. It's going to be a chilly day, so something fun to do in a warm space. And Lana is dropping the link in the chat to learn more about it. So know that that's an option if you're available and around in Minneapolis this Saturday. And then to share that we are going to go on an immersion in Alabama in the first week of May. We've done this is our second trip with CLNE, and we'll be going to Montgomery and Selma from Thursday, May 2nd through Sunday the 5th. And this trip, this experience, the immersion is really focusing on several really big leaders in Alabama, one being Michelle Browder. She's an artist. She's created these amazing statues of the mothers of gynecology. She teaches the true history of how so much of our modern gynecological care came at the expense of Black enslaved women, and she lifts that up. She has a beautiful art exhibit. She takes us on a journey to learn more. And then also we'll be visiting the EJI Legacy Museum and the Memorial, and they have a new Freedom Sculpture Garden that will be opening up soon that will be available to us. And that is created by Brian Stevenson, who's the author of Just Mercy. He's a lawyer who works, he's amazing. If you look up the EJI, a lot about him. I can't quite do the 10-second pitch on him, but we'll be visiting all of that. Then we'll be going to Selma and visiting Sam Walker, who is part of the civil rights movement. He is leading the museum there, and then also someone connected to a friend of ours Jenny Engertson. She's an author here, and she is actually going to be publishing a book about the former mayor of Selma soon. And so we're hoping to be able to meet a few of her friends. So if you're interested, we're going to have a meeting on Monday just to share all the details a little more deeply, get things set up for travel. This group will be about 12 folks we're hoping to come down with us, and we have some space available. So if you have any interest, please join us. I think Lana already dropped that into the chat too. Otherwise, you can look at our website for more information. And then lastly, we'll be back next month. More conversation to be had on the 15th, and the Zoom link, we'll send that again. So thank you so much for this time. Thank you, PK, for sharing your stories.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Pastor
all.
Kelly.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
all. Stay warm.
You too.
Well,
See you, Lisa.
Take care. Have a good night.
Good night. Great having you with us, Wanda. Everybody, blessings.